The Sony A6700 or the Fujifilm X-S20. Which one to buy? I test them both at the same time. One is more expensive than the other, but what is the total price if you add lenses, SD cards and batteries? You will find out in this comparison of two APS-C hybrid monsters. Spoiler, they're both amazing, but only one can be the best. Both cameras are made for hybrid users, and these users are people who are both photographers and filmmakers. These cameras can do both very well, but focus a bit more on making film. In your decision-making process, if these cameras are right for you, you could ask yourself if you need advanced filmmaking functions. If not, you might be paying quite some extra money for functions you won't use so much. The Sony A6700 is an update to the 3-year-older Sony A6600, while the Fujifilm X-S20 is a follow-up to the 3-year-older X-S10. The A6700 was released in July 2023, while the X-S20 is just a month older. Depending on where you are in the world, the A6700 could cost you a bit more money. In the USA, for example, the price difference is just $100, but here in the Netherlands, the difference is more than $400. I have seen that the Sony A6700 is getting less expensive, probably in order to compete with cameras like the X-S20. Special and unique features are the 4K 120fps slow motion on the A6700 and 6.2K 30fps open gate on the X-S20. They both can film 4K up to 60fps in 16:9 ratio, but only the X-S20 can film in DCI 17:9, which is the more cinematic ratio. Subject recognition and tracking are possible on both cameras with a wide variety of subjects. These include the eyes, heads and bodies of humans and animals, trains, cars, trains, planes, trains, drones, trains and insects. Did I mention trains? We're going to test the details of this camera, looking at colors and megapixels.
But in other videos you say megapixels don't count.
That is true. Megapixels shouldn't be the main factor to decide whether to buy a camera or not, but it is good to zoom in on the details and see how they compare. Both sensors have 26 megapixels, which is great for all kinds of photography, and they both have continuous or burst shooting. But here big differences come in play. Both 26 megapixel sensors have a backside illuminated design, and this means they process light in a more efficient way, and this results in a better overall image quality and low light performance. The sensors are of the type APS-C, which means they have a 1.5 times crop in comparison to full-frame sensors. Now, Fujifilm doesn't have any full-frame sensor cameras, but Sony does, and that means they also have full-frame lenses. It is possible to use these lenses on the A6700, but keep in mind that you always have a crop of 1.5 times. And that means that a 24mm lens will give you a 36mm field of view. Both cameras can also take photos in the more efficient HEIF format, where you can take 10-bit photos instead of 8-bit JPEGs, and the HEIF images are smaller in file size. Just remember that not all Windows computers will be able to natively show HEIF images, but luckily there is free software for this, which you can find in the Microsoft Store. Continuous or burst shooting is possible with both cameras, but the X-S20 has a clear advantage here, since you can take up to 30 photos per second, where the A6700 can take more than 11 per second. Taking more than 11 photos per second is important if you find yourself in situations where you want to capture fast-moving objects like birds, wildlife or sports. Testing the burst photography on both cameras at 10 fps JPEG on the X-S20 and 11 fps on the A6700, I noticed you have a big buffer and you can use the cameras right after. Another unique feature to the X-S20 is pre-shot. This function will let you pre-record up to 20 frames when you half press the shutter button. Once you completely press it, it will save the 20 frames it took before. This will help you catch moments you else might have missed. For example, a bird taking off. This function works in high-speed burst modes, but does ask a lot of the processor. And using JPEG plus RAW is where I noticed the camera would sometimes freeze a bit because it got too much for the processor. What is clear is that the shape of the cameras is different. The Sony A6700 uses a rangefinder shape, while the X-S20 looks more like a traditional DSLR with the viewfinder on top. The rangefinder style does make the camera more compact, and it seems that is where Sony is going for. But I'm a left-eye shooter, and that means my nose gets pressed up on the screen when I use the viewfinder. And as you could have seen in my A6700 review, my nose even changed shape after using the camera like that. The viewfinders have nearly the same pixel count and the A6700 has a bigger magnification. This is good because the bigger the magnification, the more you see of what the sensor sees. The A6700 does have a faster refresh rate of 120 frames per second, just in case you're gonna film slow motion through the EVF. Both models have deep and comfortable grips and the placement of the buttons feel natural, but more on the buttons later in this video. Sony A6700 has the USB-C port, micro HDMI, microphone and headphone input all on the left side, while the XS20 just plays the USB-C, micro HDMI and mic inputs on the left side, the headphone jack on the right and the SD card slot on the bottom with the battery. The upside of putting them at one side of the camera is that you only have to keep free space at one side of the body in case you're using a case. Oh, wait, the other way around. The XS20 seems more balanced with some inputs left and right, but putting the SD card slot on the bottom with the battery is a bit difficult when you have it mounted to a strap, tripod or in a cage. Since you could charge the battery without taking it out by using the USB-C port, it is annoying you still have to take the camera from, for example, a tripod to get the card out. So for card placement, the Sony wins. With the A6700, it's easier to switch between manual, aperture, program and shutter mode since it has a separate dial. With the XS20 you can choose this too, but the film and vlog mode are also on the same dial, so you can choose them separately. A special dial on the XS20 is the one for film simulations. Fujifilm is famous for their old film rolls, and since a while they are incorporating these looks on their cameras. The XS20 is a camera for users who like to use filters, and you can change these by using the dial on the top left of the body. If you don't like or use the film simulations, it is possible to assign another function to this dial, like the ISO. The XS20 is the only one featuring a flash. This flash can be used for photography and works well with the film simulations to create a nostalgic feeling. For both camera counts that nearly every button and dial is customizable, and that means you could change the function of almost everything. Where the A6700 has more options on the D-pad with drive mode, display, ISO and light compensation, the XS20 has touch gestures you can change in the menu. Long story short, both cameras have many customizable options, they just work a bit different. Are these cameras weatherproof? Well, the Sony A67 is, but the XS20 is not. Weather sealed or weatherproof in this case means it's sealed so well dust and water drops won't come in. It really depends on what kind of user you are if you need a weather sealed camera or not. I know enough photographers who always cover their weather sealed cameras even with the tiniest bit of rain. In that case you might not need a weather sealed model. It is also the dust resistance that is quite important. Back in 2017 and 18 I did some film projects in Zambia and Malawi where it was dry with quite some sand flying around. At the end of the day, your camera needs to work and you don't want to find sand inside. So I'm very happy I have my Lumix GH5S by my side, which still works. If you will use the camera in studio or casual settings, it doesn't really matter if they are weather sealed or not. Still, the A6700 wins this fight because it's weather sealed. Both of these cameras are amazing when it comes to shooting film and have their unique capabilities and flaws. Both cameras can film UHD 4K up to 60 frames per second using oversampled 6K footage. This means that a 6K image is recorded and is reduced to a 4K resolution. Looking at bit rates at 4K and 24 FPS, the A6700 goes up to a bitrate of 280 Mbps, where the XS20 reaches 360 Mbps. This means you can record more information with the Fujifilm. Only the XS20 can film DCI 4K 60 FPS 17:9, the standard aspect ratio for cinema productions. It can also film in 6.2K 30 FPS open gate. Open gate means that the complete sensor is being used and this footage has a 3:2 ratio. Both options also have a maximum of 422 10-bit and 360 Mbps. The unique feature of the Sony A6700 is that it can film in 4K up to 120 FPS with a bitrate of 280 Mbps and 422 10-bit color depth. Remember that I said the XS20 records at a higher bitrate at 24 FPS? Well, the A6700 reaches higher bit rates when you film at 30 FPS or 60 FPS. At 30 FPS you get 300 and at 60 FPS even 600 Mbps. So if you compare the 4K 60 FPS options, the A6700 would win over the XS20 looking at bitrate. We have to talk about crops.
Hey.
No, not those crops. The zoom-ins when you film in certain modes. When you use the X-S20 at 4K up to 30 FPS, no crop is applied. But when you go up to 60 FPS, a small crop will be used. The A6700 uses the same field of view using both 24, 30 and 60 FPS. But it is when you turn on 4K 120 FPS you will have to deal with a hefty crop of 1.58 times. This is quite a zoom in and can either be a blessing or a curse. It is bad if you want to keep a wide angle, but good if you do need to zoom in a little bit more. It shows the super slow motion function on the Sony is not perfect yet. I am pretty sure this will be different when a newer version of this camera comes out. Both also have their own lock image profiles, which give you a high dynamic range. This means the most information of the highlights and shadows possible. And this is very handy when you start color grading the footage. How much light and information are captured is measured in light stops, which is 14 stops for both cameras. Where Sony uses their S-Log 3 profile for all situations, Fujifilm has F-Log and F-Log 2. F-Log should be used when you work with shadows and less light, while F-Log 2 is good for bright days and highlights. Sony does have S-Log 3 with their Cine profile, which will give even flatter images and are more difficult to color correct. Luckily, both cameras have easier to use cinematic color profiles. These will give you a cinematic look without the need to color correct them. At least that's what the manufacturers say. I would always color correct them a bit so you can create your own style. On the Fujifilm X-S20 you could choose to use the Eterna Cinema Film Simulation, which you can turn on easily by using the big dial on the top left of the camera. Sony has S-Cinetone, which you can turn on by going into the menu. Click on Menu, go to Exposure and Color, scroll to number 5, Color and Tone, and select Picture Profile. Scroll down to Picture Profile 11 in order to turn on S-Cinetone. It is good to know that every picture profile on the Sony is completely customizable, so you could even use the S-Log 3 Gamma with S-Cinetone color mode. With the X-S20, it is not possible to use Eterna Cinema in combination with F-Log or F-Log 2. I do think it is easier to set these settings on the X-S20, but the A6700 has more in-depth options. In order to get the best video quality, the X-S20 made it possible to send out ProRes RAW and Blackmagic RAW to an external recorder. We're talking about 6.2K 30 FPS 12-bit RAW footage, which is uncompressed film. For the highest possible resolution, the X-S20 is the obvious choice, but not everyone needs 6.2K or RAW footage. If you're a slow motion filmer, then of course the A6700 is a more logical choice. Also, don't forget that both the 360 Mbps and 600 Mbps files might be heavy for your computer. This means you'll have to create proxy files in order to edit smoothly. Proxy files are smaller HD files just to edit with. But creating proxy files can also take a lot of time depending on the amount of files and the speed of your computer. After going through both video menus, I noticed you can customize more in the A6700. Think of uploading your own LUTs or adjusting all the color profiles. Let's talk about SD cards. Both cameras have a single SD card slot which uses UHS 2 cards. But there's a significant difference here, because if you want to use those high bitrate speeds, you need faster cards, which are more expensive. And you might think,
well, I'll just film in lower bitrate.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. In order to use the A6700's 4K super slow motion function, you need at least UHS2 V60 cards. To film in higher 4K modes, you even need V90 cards, which are not cheap. For the Fujifilm X-S20, I used the SanDisk Extreme Pro 300 Mbps U3 Class 10, which costs. The A6700 is already the more expensive camera, so keep in mind you also need more expensive SD cards. Making vlogs could be a great reason to buy either camera, and both cameras have internal optical stabilization. This means that the sensor is moving in order to catch shakes and small movements. And this is very handy when you use the camera while walking. Good sound is important too, and I tested it outside. So I'm here with the Sony A6700 and the Fujifilm X-S20, and right now I'm testing the audio I'm about a meter away from the camera, so I'm stepping a little bit closer now. I'll be very close to the camera of the A6700, and I'm close as well to the X-S20. I see the X-S20, it just picked up on me now, and back to the Sony. I'll be stepping a little bit further away. You probably heard the taxis coming by. Just checking how we're picking up. I'm just walking out of the screen to see what happens, what it picks up. So, what do you think of the sound? As with all cameras that offer high bit and frame rates, they might overheat. The X-S20 has 2 screw holes at the back, which makes it possible to attach a fan to it, but this is not possible with the A6700. If you make small clips, overheating shouldn't happen, but for interviews, it could be a big problem. I did a test where I made it extra warm. After more than an hour of recording in 4K 422 10-bit, both cameras were still recording. They felt warm, but probably could have gone for way longer. I know both cameras can overheat because I had it happen to me before. But more interesting of this test is the battery. Where the X-S20 had more than half left, the A6700 just had 36% left, and it confirms that battery life on the A6700 is just very bad. The X-S20 uses the NPW235, which should last for 750 to 800 shots according to the CIPA rating. The A6700 has the NPFZ100. As you can see, the Sony battery is bigger but lasts way shorter than any other camera I've used from any brand. The A6700 uses a lot of power in every mode, and you will have to buy a second battery if you'd like to last longer than just one afternoon. I pointed both cameras at the same color card in order to test the ISO and noise. We're looking at raw images at ISO 160, and both seem very sharp and without noise. At 6400 though, the Fujifilm seems to have a little bit more noise and less details. But at 12,800, it's the other way around, and the Fujifilm camera on the right seems to have more details and less noise. Going up to 51,200, again the Fujifilm seems to win if we talk about noise and details. I didn't go higher because 51,200 is the maximum ISO of the Fujifilm, while the Sony A6700 can go up to 100,000 plus. Both cameras can detect and track a wide variety of subjects. Let's start with some shots of the tropical rose-ringed parakeet. The focus speed can vary depending on the available light and the kind of lens you use, but the focus accuracy has more to do with the camera itself. With bird detection on, it would pick up on the eyes. With both cameras I noticed that birds cannot be too far from the camera, else it won't be picked up. Human focus works a lot better as it recognizes people way faster and from further away. If a person is far away, it will first recognize the body, and when close enough, the eyes are picked up. With people running towards the camera, it could get messy if there are other people in the frame too. Especially when the running subject came close, both cameras started to wonder where to focus on. One thing I really like with the A6700 is that you can switch between subject detection directly from the LCD screen, even while shooting film. On the X-S20 you'd have to press the Q button to bring up the quick menu in order to change the subject recognition, but this only works when you're not filming. The last part doesn't really seem like a big problem though. Neither of these cameras have automatic subject recognition and selection like newer Nikon cameras have. I noticed the A6700 autofocus is faster and more reliable. Autofocus still works and tracks with the A6700 when you use the 4K 120 FPS mode, which I think is very impressive. The same counts for the X-S20 when you use the burst of 20 or crop 30 FPS. There is a difference in tracking. On the Sony A6700 you can tap the screen and it will attach the focus to what it sees, track it. The Fujifilm can do that, but it is possible to half press the shutter button in order to let the focus attach itself to that object and track it. For the X-S20 this only works in photo mode, while tracking works for all modes with the Sony A6700. The X-S20 has been and still is the cheaper option of the two. And don't forget you need more batteries and more expensive SD cards for the Sony A6700. But it doesn't stop there. Both brands have a big lineup when it comes to their lenses. The Fujifilm uses XF and XC lenses, and Sony has the E and FE lenses. You have much more to choose from if you use Sony, but the high-end lenses will be way more expensive than the Fujifilm ones. When choosing the right camera for you, also make sure to check which lenses you like to buy, because the final price might be completely different. Remember that I said only one camera could be the best? That is true, but I should add for you. If you're already a Sony or Fujifilm user, your choice might be a bit easier. I would say the X-S20 is the faster photo camera, while the A6700 is the faster film camera in terms of frames per second. Autofocus of the A6700 is unbeatable, but the X-S20 has a way better video resolution output. The film simulations on the X-S20 are very charming and are great for instant use. In the end, both cameras are actually great for both photography and film. If you're still not sure yet which one to choose, make sure to check out my in-depth reviews of the A6700 and X-S20 on my channel.